A beautiful piece of motorsport that was interfered with inappropriately. We've slightly adjusted McLaren team boss Andrea Stella's quote there, and we're using it to make a slightly different point to him as well. Unlike Stella, we're not necessarily taking issue with the decision that was made by the stewards regarding Lando Norris's late race pass on Max Verstappen at the US Grand Prix. Regardless of what you think about who was at fault, if anyone, the real problem that was exposed here was that F1's recent attempts to tightly regulate wheel-to-wheel racing are failing. Understandably, the Red Bull position on this was a straightforward one, presenting the argument that the rules are clear and Norris breached them, so the penalty was fair. But it's easy to take that view when you're the side benefiting from it. Any team would do the same in that position. Just as understandable was McLaren's view that Norris ended up off the track because the car he was trying to pass on the outside not only forced him out there, but also went outside track limits itself. Before we go any further, let's explain the key points outlined by the stewards in their decision to give Norris a 5-second penalty that cost him a podium finish. They said that because Norris was not level with Verstappen at the apex of the corner, which we can clearly see was the case from the TV footage, Norris had therefore lost the right to the corner. That meant he was not entitled to gain an advantage once he went off track, seemingly even if he was forced out there by the car on his inside. However, the stewards only gave a 5-second penalty instead of 10 because Norris had little alternative other than to leave the track due to the proximity of Verstappen's car, and at this point they also acknowledged that Verstappen went off track too. But it would appear that as the defending car, Verstappen was allowed to leave the track and maintain his position. Earlier in the race, George Russell and Yuki Tsunoda picked up penalties for forcing another car off track when making passes down the inside at the same corner, even if they didn't go off track themselves. So what this appears to boil down to is that F1's current racing rules are weighted heavily in favour of the car being overtaken, regardless of if they are on the inside or the outside. If you're defending on the inside, you're allowed to run deep into the corner and go off track on the exit, and the car battling on your outside must stay behind you. But if someone is attacking you on the inside, all you need to do is stay far enough alongside to be able to claim you are forced off, and again, the overtake on you is illegal. F1's new racing guidelines were supposed to evolve the judgments around these marginal moves to get away from the simple who was ahead at the apex, as that was deemed an oversimplification that encouraged people to overdrive on the way into a corner on the assumption that simply being in front in a freeze frame taken at the apex would entitle them to do whatever they wanted beyond that point. But it would appear from the decision taken over the Norris-Verstappen incident that it's still the case that whoever is ahead at the apex is king. Verstappen and Red Bull team boss Christian Horner both pointed to Verstappen's penalty at the same track in 2017 when he lost a podium for passing Kimi Räikkönen outside of track limits. But that's a pretty meaningless comparison, as that was a simple case of a driver gaining a position by cutting a corner, the simplest of all track limits scenarios to judge. As is so often the case in F1, parts of the rulebook become overly complex because of the teams pushing for clear, black and white rules on everything. But something as dynamic as on-track combat doesn't lend itself to that, and those most affected by this, the competitors, have taken F1 down a route of preferring over-regulation versus placing more responsibility with the interpretation of the stewards on the day. Inevitably, the incident also led to calls for tracks to do away with asphalt runoffs and replace them all with gravel traps. But in this case, it's hard to see how that would have solved the problem. If there had been a gravel trap at the end of that straight, the battle probably plays out the same, except one or both cars end up in the gravel. Then any decision would be based on the same racing rules, so presumably Norris wouldn't be allowed to say he was forced into the gravel by Verstappen, he would just be told he wasn't entitled to space because he wasn't ahead at the apex. McLaren boss Andrea Stella called his team's interpretation of the incident polar opposite to the view of the stewards. He faced questions around why McLaren didn't order Norris to give the place back to let him have another chance to attack Verstappen, which is what Red Bull boss Christian Horner claimed he would have done if the roles were reversed, stating that he felt Norris would have had the pace to make the pass cleanly before the end of the race. But Stella said McLaren didn't give Norris that instruction because they were so sure Norris hadn't done anything wrong. Stella even said he thought any investigation would be for Verstappen pushing Norris off the track, so McLaren instructed Oscar Piastri to get as close to Verstappen as possible in case he got a penalty after the race. Stella felt that if Verstappen had kept his car within track limits, then it would have been clear that Norris would need to give the place back. but he felt the drivers were neutral on that front because they both went off track, so therefore one shouldn't be judged to have gained, because McLaren's view was that both drivers took advantage of going outside track limits. He also felt Verstappen disallowed the car on his outside to make a pass and called for statistics on how many times Max has used this way for defending. But even if you don't like what Verstappen did, he's not really the bad guy here. He clearly has an understanding of what's allowed under the current rules, and he drives right up to the limit of those rules. Stella also criticised the stewards for rushing to make the decision in race rather than taking the time to talk to the drivers and spend longer looking at the data, given it was such a marginal call with potential championship implications. Perhaps that urgency was because the stewards didn't want to delay a decision that would affect who stood on the podium, or perhaps it was just because under their interpretation of F1's current racing rules, flawed as they might be, the outcome of any investigation was clear to them. On the other side of the fence, Horner praised the stewards for dealing with the matter rapidly and decently, and also referenced the desire from F1 to have the right people on the podium. Stella admitted that McLaren was a little upset with Verstappen's pass on Norris at the start of the Grand Prix, but he said they were willing to accept no action being taken there, as mitigation is often applied to moves at the start of a race. He added that he respects how difficult the job is for the stewards, but then called on them to have respect for their job as well, to take more time over their decisions. Mercedes boss Toto Wolff made some curious comments on this subject after the race, eventually saying that he needed to hold himself back to avoid saying anything that would get him in trouble. While accepting that the stewards are in a really difficult situation and believing that everybody is giving their best, he also hinted at inconsistencies that he thinks FIA President Mohammed Ben Sulayem is going to look at. Wolff wouldn't elaborate on exactly what he meant, but he said we need to try to understand whether there are certain patterns in the stewarding decisions and whether that correlates to some of the situations. When pushed to expand on it, he said F1 had great stewards that have either been in the racing car or have a non-biased view on situations, doing the best of their abilities for a job that is truly difficult. He then said we must put everybody in the same category, implying that he doesn't believe every steward currently used by the FIA is capable of meeting those criteria. He was more direct when discussing the penalty George Russell picked up when passing Valtteri Bottas on the inside at the same corner as the Norris-Verstappen incident, calling it inexplicable. The sad thing about all of this was that it overshadowed a brilliant battle between the top two drivers in the championship and Ferrari's superb 1-2 that took place ahead of all this. We can only apologise to Ferrari, as prior to the Verstappen Norris incident, the video we were working on was going to be led on how the red cars ended up dominating this weekend. Behind them, in many ways, the battle for third summed up the season so far, with Norris's McLaren making inroads later on and Verstappen's Red Bull finding itself on the back foot and trying to cling on to an advantage it had built up earlier. And with 5 races to go in the season, the competitive picture looks finely poised now. Red Bull appeared to be back on form over most of the weekend, with Verstappen winning the sprint race from pole and looking likely to have claimed pole for the Grand Prix as well, were it not for George Russell's late crash in Q3. But the RB20 fell out of its rediscovered sweet spot on Sunday, with Verstappen complaining of poor balance, plus a lack of grip and braking performance, and being unable to rotate the car the way he wanted. Verstappen felt that Red Bull made its car worse, with Horner saying the team engineered in too much understeer, which killed the front tyres and made things even worse once everybody moved on to the hard tyres later in the race. As for McLaren, its weekend narrative went from one of facing questions about if it was now the team facing a competitive dip to a promising race performance. Nobody could live with Ferrari, which seems to have finally cured its car's ills with recent updates, but McLaren could take heart from the fact it was able to come back at Verstappen over the course of the race. If Red Bull being back in the hunt still seems like a significant swing given how far ahead McLaren has been in recent races, Stella seemed relaxed on that front, saying of the final 6 events of the season, McLaren expected this to be its weakest circuit. Stella believes that the heavy braking into slow corners, which often requires the combination of braking and turning at the same time, plus some very high-speed corners, are 2 areas where McLaren's car is not at its best. He praised Red Bull for making gains with its troubled car over the recent break between races, but also warned that McLaren expects the remaining tracks on the calendar to suit its car more. An optimistic McLaren, a recovering Red Bull and an on-song Ferrari is a great recipe for the rest of 2024. Let's hope overcomplicated racing rules don't spoil it.